The shadow, Carl Jung's warning to the world, the truth you keep hiding from yourself. What if the part of you that you fear the most is the part that can heal you? There's a reason you keep repeating the same pain, a reason you explode unexpectedly, judge others harshly, or feel empty for no clear reason. Carl Jung called it the shadow, not evil, not broken, just the side of yourself you've never dared to face. This isn't about fixing what's wrong. It's about seeing what's been forgotten. Because the longer you avoid the shadow, the more it controls your life from behind the curtain. It shapes your emotions, your relationships, your society, and you don't even realize it. In this video, we'll walk into the darkness, not to get lost in it, but to understand it. Because healing doesn't begin with light. It begins when you're brave enough to look into what you've denied all along. This is not self-help, this is self-truth. Let's begin. Jung once wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. We often take pride in our virtuous side, our kindness, generosity, and good manners. But what about the opposite? The envy, selfishness, jealousy, anger, desire. We bury them deep in the mind, mask them with smiles, courtesy, or silence. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. It waits for the right moment to emerge when we're hurt, intoxicated, or overwhelmed by rage for no clear reason. In those moments, a careless word can become a knife. A reckless action can destroy a relationship. And we are left shocked, wondering why we behaved that way. The truth is, the shadow is not an enemy. It only becomes dangerous when forgotten. When a person is unaware of their own shadow, they cannot master it, and this is precisely what makes them more vulnerable to being ruled by it, leading to actions they no longer recognize as their own. This introduction is not meant to frighten or assign blame. It is an invitation, a courageous invitation to look inward, not just at the light, but also the darkness. Because without light, there would be no shadow, but without the shadow, our light could never be complete. We begin this journey not to become better people, but to become our true selves whole, honest, and strong enough to face what we once feared. And only by daring to look into that depth can true healing begin. The forgotten self, the parts we hide from ourselves. There are parts of us that never appear in the light, not because they don't exist, but because we deliberately refuse to see them. Carl Jung called this the shadow, our inner darkness. Not a demon, but the neglected side of the soul, desires we deem shameful, emotions considered weak, reactions we'd feel embarrassed to show in front of others. We try to live as if those parts aren't real. We build a self-image, ethical, loving, successful, composed. But beneath that mask, there are still muffled whispers, an unspoken rage, a suppressed jealousy, a desire to be authentic silenced by expectations and social norms. Jung said, "The shadow is what you do not want to be." But because we don't want to be it, we never learn to dialogue with it. The shadow doesn't vanish. It just hides deeper in the unconscious and erupts when we least expect it, when we lose control, when we're drunk, exhausted, or irrationally enraged by something trivial. The truth is, the shadow isn't as frightening as we think. Within it lie not just negative traits, but energy, instincts, creative potential, and deeply human needs to be loved, to be protected, to be acknowledged. But when we treat it like an enemy, it reacts like one. It rebels, overthrows, and confuses us about who we really are. When we reject the shadow, we also reject a part of ourselves, and the result is internal division. We cease to be whole. We live in tension, imbalance, and emotional vulnerability. Recognizing the shadow is the first step on the journey of individuation. It is when we begin to turn inward, facing the parts of ourselves we once hated, were ashamed of, or wished to forget. It is an act of courage not to conquer the darkness, but to understand it. For only through understanding can we reconcile, and only through reconciliation can we become whole, not perfect, but more authentic and at peace. When others are just mirrors, seeing what we reject in ourselves, have you ever intensely disliked someone without knowing why? Perhaps because of a small gesture, a tone of voice, or an attitude they displayed, and the emotions that arose in you were almost uncontrollable. Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection. When we can't face a part of ourselves, we unconsciously project it onto others. If we're unwilling to admit that we can be selfish, rude, or weak, then when we encounter someone displaying those traits, we feel immediate discomfort, not because they're truly the problem, but because they activate something within us we've rejected. Others, in this case, are not the cause, they're mirrors. They reflect the part of our shadow we haven't yet acknowledged, and because it hasn't been accepted, it becomes hypersensitive, easily triggered. A simple comment can make us furious. An unintended action can deeply offend us. But the truth is, those feelings come from within, not from the outside. Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Every irritation, every judgment, if we pause and ask, what part of me is reacting like this? We take one step further on the path of inner maturity. Projection is also what often causes conflict with loved ones, coworkers, or romantic partners. We believe we're defending what's right, but in reality, we're reacting from an unhealed wound. We demand others change so we can feel at ease, instead of turning inward and asking, what insecurity am I running from? What part of myself am I denying? The key isn't controlling others. The key lies in observing ourselves when we react to others. Every projection is an opportunity to understand the inner world more clearly, and when we're brave enough to admit, I've been like that, or I carry that too, anger softens into compassion for them and for ourselves. When we no longer need others to be perfect for us to feel safe, we begin to enter a state of inner freedom, no longer ruled by unconscious shadow, but becoming the conscious author of our emotions, awareness, and actions. The shadow isn't just the dark side, it's a forgotten treasure in the unconscious. When we hear the word shadow, we often think of negativity, anger, jealousy, selfishness, desire, hatred. But Carl Jung once warned, if we only see the shadow as an enemy, we will never truly understand it. Because buried deep within that darkness lies not only fearsome qualities, but also precious parts of ourselves that have been buried and forgotten. The shadow is not only what we fear, but also what we were once forced to abandon. A child with extraordinary creativity might hide their artistic passion in the shadow if they're told it's impractical or unrealistic. Someone criticized for being too blunt might learn to stay silent, and that honest directness also slips into the dark. Gradually, the most vibrant, courageous, and truthful parts of our being are imprisoned simply because society, family, or circumstances didn't accept them. Shadow work is not just about healing, it's about uncovering. It helps us not only move through the bad parts, but also rediscover the beautiful traits. We once forgot we had strength, passion, imagination, an inner voice, all waiting for us to return. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest student, once wrote, "The shadow is not always an opponent. It's like a person you must learn to live with, sometimes to dialogue with, sometimes to love." So instead of running from the shadow as if it were forbidden territory, try approaching it as if you were reclaiming a long-lost part of yourself. You might just find what you've been longing for, not out in the world, but in the part of yourself you are most afraid to face. Wholeness doesn't come from eliminating darkness, but from befriending it. It's not perfection, it's truth. And that truth is the beginning of freedom, creativity, and inner peace. When the ego is too strong, the shadow is imprisoned and waiting to erupt. The ego is a tool that helps us function in society. It shapes our personality, helps us manage ourselves, make decisions, and maintain order. But when the ego becomes too dominant, it doesn't just coordinate, it becomes a warden, repressing any part of us that doesn't fit the mold. Have you ever seen someone explode over something trivial, or have you ever lost your temper irrationally and later asked yourself, why did I act like that? That's the shadow speaking because it's been silenced for too long. Jung said that when the ego refuses to acknowledge the shadow becomes an autonomous entity. It begins to govern our emotions, behaviors, even our dreams without our awareness. Prolonged sadness, inexplicable irritability, a persistent sense of disorientation. These can all be signs of a shadow that's been locked away too long under the pressure of a perfect ego. One of the greatest mistakes of modern life is trying to appear strong, calm, and positive all the time. But no one can live without ever feeling anger, sadness, fear, envy, or vulnerability. The problem isn't the feelings themselves, it's our refusal to acknowledge them. We fear losing our image, our control, our role. So we lock away our truest parts in the shadow and call that maturity. But the ego cannot suppress the shadow forever. One day, it will crack, and that crack often appears at the most unexpected times: midlife crises, depression, loss of direction, or the collapse of significant relationships. To avoid this collapse, the only way is to bravely look inward, lower the ego's guard. Ask, what part of myself am I avoiding? Admit, I too have uncomfortable parts, but they are part of me. Only when the ego steps aside can the shadow speak, and only then can true inner balance be restored. Not through perfect control, but through deep understanding and the courage to heal from within. The inner negotiation, a journey to face what we once rejected, accepting the shadow, is not a single moment. It's a process. And that process is anything but comfortable. It's like a long, tense negotiation between the ego and the part of the soul we once ignored, feared, or denied. Carl Jung called this the most difficult work of human life because we're not fixing someone else's flaws. We're confronting the distortions within ourselves. No one enjoys facing their own selfishness. No one smiles when they realize they too harbor desire, jealousy, or even quiet aggression deep within. But if we don't face these truths, they will control us silently from the dark. This journey isn't about fighting the shadow to eliminate it. It's about negotiating to understand and integrate it. Jung once wrote, "The shadow is a person you must live with. Sometimes you'll love it, sometimes resist it, but you absolutely cannot ignore it." This path begins with observing our emotions, especially the intense, negative ones. Each time we become irrationally angry, envious, disturbed, or fearful, that is a door opening to the shadow. Instead of blaming others, ask, what is this emotion revealing about me? Instead of suppressing or judging, acknowledge, there's a part of me that still hasn't been heard. Next comes honesty. No one knows you better than yourself, but also no one can deceive you more skillfully than you. The ego is a master of justification, always eager to maintain a polished self-image. But healing doesn't begin with beauty, it begins with truth. After identifying the rejected part, the next step is integration. This means allowing that part to speak, to be expressed safely and consciously. For example, instead of suppressing anger and then lashing out at loved ones, we learn to set boundaries firmly. Instead of fearing our vulnerability, we learn to admit our need for love without shame. This is a long journey with no shortcuts. It requires patience, self-compassion, and sometimes support from others: a listener, a therapist, or simply a mirror that reflects what we haven't dared to see. But the reward is priceless. An ego that no longer pretends to be strong, a soul that knows how to comfort itself, and a human being who is whole, not because they're perfect, but because they dare to live truthfully with everything they are. This is not about defeating the darkness, but taking the first step into the light. Imperfection is not a flaw, it is what makes us whole. In an age where everyone is trying to shine, brighter, be better, more attractive, more correct, admitting our flaws has become one of the hardest things to do. Since childhood, we've been taught to be a good person, to do the right thing, and to avoid the bad. But no one teaches us how to live with the parts that aren't perfect, the parts that are vulnerable, and that sometimes hurt others. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no light without shadow, and no wholeness without imperfection." That quote touches on a profound truth. What we call wholeness isn't about eliminating what's bad, but learning to accept that it exists and discovering how to live peacefully with it. Imperfection, paradoxically, is what brings depth, authenticity, and beauty to human beings. People who are too polished make others uneasy. Those who appear flawless often seem distant. But someone who can admit to being weak, wrong, or having failed is someone who can truly touch another person's heart. Because all of us are struggling, and sometimes what we need most isn't a shining example, but a person who can say, "I've been broken too, but I kept going." It is the shadow, our imperfections, that makes the journey of life feel real. It holds unprocessed emotions, rejected needs, unexplored talents. It's the deep space where we're called to stop living by external standards and begin listening to the inner voice. Self-acceptance doesn't mean resignation or excusing our mistakes. It means honesty, the courage to face the fact that we are not invincible, not always right, not immune to flaws. And that is where compassion begins, not only for others, but for ourselves. When we dare to say, I'm imperfect and I'm okay with that, we not only free ourselves from pressure, but we also create space for those around us to be themselves, without having to pretend. Imperfection is an inseparable part of being human, and when we embrace it with understanding and gentleness, that very place once seen as a weakness becomes the starting point of real growth. A growth not built on victories, but on the courage to live truthfully. The dark side of community, when society conspires to forget uncomfortable truths. The shadow doesn't just exist within individuals. It also lives in groups, in communities, and even in entire cultures. Jung called this the collective shadow, the unconscious part that is rejected not just by one person, but by an entire society. We often believe that evil, cruelty, or violence are personal issues, but history proves otherwise. The greatest tragedies, wars, genocides, oppression often originate from collective false beliefs nurtured silently over generations. And from that, a collective shadow is born, one that no one wants to own, yet everyone lives with. The collective shadow rarely shows up as blood and violence. It hides in callous words, unconscious decisions, and repeated prejudices that go unquestioned. It's the silence in the face of injustice, the laughter when the powerless are mocked, the invisible consensus when society collectively chooses to look away. And just like the personal shadow, the collective shadow becomes more dangerous, the more it's denied. It doesn't vanish, it simmers in the collective dream, in the media, in legal systems, in how we raise children or define a good person. The more a society avoids it, the more control it gains over our behavior. Awakening is not just a personal act, it's a generational process that requires collective courage to face a difficult truth, that all of us knowingly or unknowingly have played a part in maintaining shadows we have yet to see. To heal the world, we must first dare to name what no one wants to hear, and accept that truth doesn't always feel good. But it is only the truth, faced with bravery and compassion, that can lead us out of the recurring cycles of unhealed wounds. The shadow hidden in everyday life, when sin wears the face of habit. The shadow doesn't always show itself through screams, blood, or overt violence. Often, it hides in things so normal that no one questions them. A careless remark, a prejudice passed down generations, a system built on emotional denial, a way of life where apathy is just routine. That is when the collective shadow is no longer a rare occurrence, but the unconscious foundation of our daily lives. We no longer see it, not because it's gone, but because it has merged into how we view the world. Jokes about gender, race, or status, seemingly harmless, quietly uphold social divisions. Parents telling children, "Don't cry like a baby," unknowingly shut down emotional connection from an early age. Teaching kids to always succeed, always behave, always be praised plants in them a deep fear of failure and an endless hunger for approval. We fail to realize that it is in the familiar, in the everyone does it this way, that the shadow is most powerful. And because it's so familiar, it's hard to notice. We only start sensing something is wrong when emotions become blocked, when generations grow up feeling empty, or when unnamed wounds manifest as depression, addiction, violence, or widespread meaninglessness. Carl Jung once warned, "What is not made conscious will be experienced as fate." When the shadow is normalized, it guides us without force. We repeat unconscious behaviors, speak words that once wounded us as children, and pass that pain on to others. And in this unnoticed loop, evil needs no villain, it only needs habit. So awakening isn't just about seeing grand tragedies, it's also about turning inward and questioning the smallest routines. A simple question like, "Why did I react that way?" can open a door into the shadow within ourselves and our society. The world doesn't become cruel because of a few bad people. It becomes cruel when too many good people choose silence, conformity, and avoidance, and so the things never questioned keep repeating until someone has the courage to pause and ask, is this truly right? And perhaps in that single pause, the shadow finally begins to be illuminated. What do we usually do with the shadow? Deny, blame, and try to forget. When faced with the darkness within ourselves or in society, our instinctive reaction isn't to accept but to reject. We brush it off, saying, I'm not like that, society isn't that bad, or that's all in the past. Instead of recognizing the shadow living inside us, we push it outward, blame others, or bury it beneath masks of morality, logic, and righteousness. Carl Jung called this the ego's defense mechanism, an unconscious strategy to preserve the image we hold of ourselves. We don't want to believe that we can be selfish, envious, weak, or cruel, but it is precisely this denial that allows those traits to control us from backstage, where the unconscious operates most powerfully. When we deny our inner darkness, we begin to see it in others. A person who feels deeply vulnerable often criticizes others for being too weak. Someone hungry for power condemns others as ambitious. A society that has yet to confront its own traumatic history rushes to paint over the present with hollow slogans and organized silence. This projection mechanism tricks us into thinking the shadow is someone else's problem, a problem of enemies, of the past, but never our own, and this is why the shadow grows stronger, more justified, more institutionalized, and more contagious in silence. We don't just deny it, we forget, and forgetfulness becomes a way to escape responsibility. Later generations want to let the past rest, not because it's healed, but because the pain is too great to touch. But like any untreated wound, it doesn't disappear, it festers. It decays, and it waits for a moment of weakness to erupt. And when it does through collective depression, crises of values, or violence between people, we once again ask, what happened? Though the answer has always been there, in the shadow we never dared to face. Denying the shadow doesn't make us better. It only makes us more fragile, because only when we acknowledge it can we choose to reconcile with it or let it rule us. If we continue to deny, the shadow will decide for us. And the most dangerous scenario, when an entire group, a community, a nation, collectively denies the shadow, no one notices that it is growing inside every decision, every action, and every terrifying silence. To recognize does not mean to approve. It means to look with understanding and from there begin to change. No one heals without first touching their wound, and no one lives fully while still running from their own darkness. How does a society truly change? The answer is not in changing leaders, rewriting laws, or shouting bold slogans. It lies in whether the community is willing to undergo a painful process to recognize, admit, and integrate the collective shadow. Integration is not whitewashing, nor is it revenge. It is bringing to light what has long been hidden. It is when generations sit together, not to assign blame, but to listen. When pain is no longer brushed aside with the phrase that's the past, but is allowed to be named, acknowledged, and honored. Jung once said, "The truth will set you free, but first, it will make you miserable." And indeed, confronting the collective shadow comes with shame, helplessness, rage, or the collapse of long-held beliefs. But if we cannot move through this inner earthquake, we remain stagnant and allow the shadow to keep shaping our future. Integrating the collective shadow is a healing journey for the whole community, where each individual must take responsibility not only for themselves, but for the past and future of their society. It requires the courage to speak up against injustice, the awareness not to repeat harm, and above all, it calls for connection, the understanding that only together can we face the darkness and emerge into light. No single individual is strong enough to bear the collective shadow, but a community brave enough to confront it, to learn from pain, to heal through truth rather than denial, will no longer be an unconscious victim of history, but a conscious creator of the future. Integrating the shadow is the first step toward awakening. And awakening isn't about becoming instantly good, it's about no longer unconsciously causing harm, no longer living asleep. The moment we awaken together is the moment the world begins to change, not through revolution, but through quiet, enduring transformation from within. When one fails to reflect, The collective may drag them into the abyss. We often believe that major mistakes, historic atrocities, or social collapse are caused by evil individuals or brutal leaders. But Carl Jung revealed a much more terrifying truth. When a person fails to confront their own shadow, the collective, through unconscious forces, can pull them into actions they themselves cannot comprehend. Personal and collective shadows are not separate. They mirror each other. A person unaware of their own envy, rage, or suppressed fear will easily be swept into groupthink. When a community begins to scapegoat, when society rationalizes exclusion, when history is rewritten for convenience, that person has no moral filter to resist. They will be pulled along blindly. Jung called this the embodiment of the collective shadow through the unconscious individual. Until one confronts their own inner darkness, they become a vessel for a larger unconscious, a container for collective trauma, ancestral fear, repressed drives unleashed without moral restraint. We've seen this in totalitarian regimes, in war, in the slaughter of innocents. And we still see it today in online hatred, social polarization, and seemingly small but recurring irrational acts. It all begins with one missing element: inner reflection. A person who never examines their emotions is easily manipulated by external narratives. And if an entire community lives that way, no one reflecting, no one asking questions, then destruction doesn't need a devil, because we become its unwitting agents. This is why shadow work is not merely personal, it is a societal duty. Every individual who emerges from unconsciousness brightens the whole. Each person who dares face their darkness lays one brick in the wall that stops the repetition of collective pain. You don't need to be a leader or have a big platform to spark change. You simply need to begin with yourself. And from there, the light will quietly spread. Don't let your lack of awareness become the shadow's gateway. Be the one who stops it. Be the one who opens the door back toward light. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Shadow work is an act of deep bravery, because it demands we look at the parts we've denied, the things we're ashamed of, the secrets we've buried. Maybe it's selfishness we never admitted, envy we've suppressed, dreams we've abandoned, or limits we refuse to acknowledge. These do not make us bad, they make us unfinished. When we admit we are not perfect, we begin to shed the mask we've worn for too long. And that's when our real self starts to breathe, again vulnerable but honest, messy but capable of regeneration. From that truth, we rebuild our ego not from false perfection, but from compassion. Once you have the courage to face your inner darkness, you realize it never asked to be punished, it asked to be heard, understood, reconciled. And from that place, something miraculous happens. You begin to see others differently. You stop judging so quickly. You realize everyone is struggling with their own shadow. You understand why people lash out, grow cold, or act out because they've never learned to listen to their own shadow. You stop expecting others to be perfect because you've learned that wholeness comes when we stop pretending and start being real. If you've ever felt the world is too chaotic, too cruel, too hard to understand, this is where change begins, not with an external revolution, but with a quiet one inside. When you heal, you become a safe place for others. When you master your shadow, you prevent the spread of the collective one. When you reconcile with yourself, you radiate energy of acceptance, compassion, and peace. Shadow work isn't a one-day journey, it's a lifetime process. But every step you take inward is a step that helps brighten the world outside. And that right there is true healing, beginning within, so the world outside can hurt a little less, be a little warmer, shine a little brighter. This is when awakening must extend beyond the self to become a collective movement. Not everyone has to be a psychoanalyst, but everyone must learn to listen to the forgotten parts of themselves and of their community. When you start seeing others not with judgment, but with compassionate curiosity, what pain is he reacting from? What is she screaming for that was once silenced? You're lighting not only your personal shadow, but the collective one. A reflective society is one that can forgive, take responsibility, and rebuild. A community that sees its shadow can stop tragedy before it repeats. Awakening is no longer the lonely act of a few, it becomes a wave of awareness, spreading from person to person, family to generation. We can begin with small acts, teaching a child to accept emotions instead of suppressing them, listening to someone in pain instead of reacting, refusing to justify cruelty in the name of virtue, recognizing seemingly harmless social habits that feed the shadow, apathy, indifference, instant labeling. All these are starting points so awakening is no longer a solo journey, but a collective force, quiet yet powerful. Remember, a single person who shines light on their shadow can save themselves, but a community who does it together can save the future. And that is why we must not stop, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation, for the souls walking beside us and those still asleep. This is no longer a private matter. This is the call of our time,